On May 25th, 1995, Lam Thanh Nguyen walked into a medical clinic near Euclid Avenue and Westminster Boulevard, probably thinking about staying low for one more day, until he looked up and saw Westminster police already inside the lobby. What made that moment hit different was the fact that Sergeant Jack Davidson and Detective Mark Nye had not set up a trap for him there, yet both men instantly recognized the same fugitive tied to a string of shootings stretching across Garden Grove, Westminster, Stanton, and the heart of Little Saigon. After weeks of helicopters circling, patrol cars sweeping blocks, and detectives chasing leads on a young Vietnamese gunman, the run ended when Lam froze in place and realized the whole thing had closed in on him by pure accident. To understand how a refugee kid ended up walking straight into the hands of officers hunting him for murder, you have to go back before the headlines, before the trial, before Little Saigon started whispering his name like bad news. Lam Thanh Nguyen belonged to that generation, shaped by the wreckage left after the Vietnam War, which meant his story did not begin in Orange County at all, but in a country still dealing with defeat, displacement, fear, and families trying to survive whatever came next. While he was still a child, his family fled Vietnam on an overcrowded boat, then spent time in refugee camps in Thailand and Indonesia before they finally made it to the United States, which already tells you instability was not some later detour in his life, but the condition he grew up in from the start. By the time the family reached Southern California in the mid-80s, they landed in Orange County, mainly around Westminster and Garden Grove, where Little Saigon had grown into the biggest Vietnamese refugee enclave in America, packed with small businesses, crowded apartments, language barriers, old trauma, and a whole lot of young people trying to figure out who they were in a place that never fully felt settled. That background mattered, not as an excuse for what Lam later did, but as the first piece of the puzzle, since even his own defense would later argue that he had been shuffled from place to place without any real stability, guidance, or grounded home life holding him in line. Once his family got to Orange County, the pressure did not vanish, since refugee parents were often working long hours. Households were stretched thin, and a lot of kids grew up between languages, between cultures, and between expectations that did not always fit the streets around them. In neighborhoods across Westminster and Garden Grove, plenty of Vietnamese teenagers found that school, family, and community life did not fully answer the need for protection, identity, or respect, so they built their own circles, first as crews and friend groups, then later as street gangs with rules, enemies, and local reputations. Lam moved through that same environment as a quiet but intense young dude, the kind of person who did not need to talk loud to get noticed, since people around him would later describe someone who adjusted to street life fast and did not seem scared of the pressure that pushed other kids backward. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, that mindset pulled him closer to the underground side of Little Saigon, where young Vietnamese gang members were already carving out names for themselves in alleys, apartments, cafes, pool halls, and parking lots, setting the stage for Lam to stop being just another refugee kid and start moving towards something far more dangerous. That shift makes more sense once you see what Little Saigon looked like in the early 1990s, since Orange County was not only a refugee stronghold by then, but also a place where Vietnamese youth gangs had become a real force, with crews building reputations through loyalty, retaliation, and whatever violence they felt would make rivals think twice. Some of these groups were made up of kids who could pass as regular students during the day, then step into a totally different role after dark, which gave the whole scene a strange edge, since the line between ordinary life and gang life stayed thin in places where everybody knew somebody connected. Lam eventually joined a gang called the Nip Family, usually shortened to NF, and that name itself carried its own kind of statement, since the crew took a slur commonly thrown at Asians and flipped it into a hood identity, almost like daring outsiders to react, while members treated the insult like a badge. In that circle, names, neighborhood ties, and who stood solid in tense moments meant everything, which is why Lam started gaining traction inside the set once people saw he was willing to do the kind of work that made others back up. Around NF, the pressure stayed high since the gang was already locked into bitter issues with the Cheap Boys, while Cambodian crews like the Tiny Rascals gang also moved through the same world, turning parts of Little Saigon into a place where grudges could follow people from restaurants to arcades to pool halls with very little warning. That is why ordinary hangouts mattered so much in this story, since a video arcade, a billiard spot, or a late dinner table could become the exact place where rival crews crossed paths, checked affiliations, and sometimes took things all the way there over pride, territory, or old scores. Inside that setting, Lam earned respect less through flashy talk than through a colder kind of usefulness, since gangs often leaned on one or two members to carry out retaliation when somebody needed to be touched, and his name started to carry weight as someone willing to fill that role. Once that happened, the movement of his life changed for real, since he was no longer just orbiting the gang world of Orange County, but stepping into the shooter's place inside it, which is exactly where the bloodier part of this story begins. By July 1994, the tension between Vietnamese crews around Garden Grove had already been simmering for months, which is why that summer afternoon did not feel unusual at first, especially around the busy intersections where traffic lights kept cars idling for long stretches. On that particular day, a car carrying several Cheap Boys members rolled to a stop at a red light with Tony Nguyen sitting inside alongside friends who had no idea that a rival crew had just spotted them nearby. At the same time, Lam Nguyen and other NIP family associates were riding through the same area, and once someone recognized the faces inside Tony's car, the atmosphere inside Lam's vehicle reportedly shifted from casual cruising to something much colder. Because gang crews often moved through Little Saigon with an eye out for rivals, that brief recognition at the intersection quickly turned into a decision that nobody inside Tony's car had any time to prepare for. While the lights stayed red and engines idled around them, the two vehicles sat only a short distance apart, which meant the seconds before the signal changed stretched out with a kind of quiet tension nobody outside the situation could see. According to later testimony, Lam stepped out and moved closer toward the Cheap Boys' vehicle, and those few moments at the intersection suddenly became the narrow window where everything could go wrong. Before traffic had a chance to start moving again, gunfire cracked through the intersection, and several shots were fired directly toward the car where Tony Nguyen and his friends were sitting. As drivers nearby slammed brakes and ducked low inside their seats, bullets tore through the vehicle, leaving chaos behind and sending Tony slumping from his seat with catastrophic injuries that changed the rest of his life. Tony Nguyen survived the attack, although doctors later confirmed that the gunshots left him permanently paralyzed, which turned what might have been another gang shooting into something far heavier once the reality of the damage became clear. Investigators began collecting statements from people who had been inside the vehicle that day, and one passenger eventually told detectives that the shooter looked like Lam Nguyen from the NIP family crew. That identification did not immediately lead to an arrest, partly because gang witnesses were often reluctant to cooperate openly, but the statement quietly placed Lam's name inside police files connected to the shooting. Not long afterward, that same passenger later said Lam approached him personally, asking whether officers had been asking questions, which detectives later interpreted as a sign that Lam already understood how serious the situation had become. Once that information reached investigators in Orange County, the Garden Grove shooting shifted from a street rumor into the starting point of a real case file, since detectives now had a victim, a witness, and a suspected gunman linked to a gang feud already brewing across Little Saigon. Although the investigation moved slowly at first, the July 1994 attack established a pattern that would soon grow darker, especially after another violent encounter placed Lam Nguyen's name even deeper inside police reports. Because only a few months later, on a crowded holiday night, another confrontation would erupt in a place where teenagers normally went simply to play games and hang out. That next moment arrived on Thanksgiving night in 1994, when Mission Control, a popular video arcade in the Little Saigon area, was filled with young Vietnamese teenagers enjoying the holiday evening without expecting any kind of gang trouble inside a place built for flashing lights and arcade machines. Outside the building, however, Lam Nguyen reportedly approached a young man named Huy Nguyen, and the first thing he asked was whether Huy was affiliated with a rival gang, which immediately pushed the conversation into dangerous territory. Because gang culture in that era often revolved around checking someone's affiliations, the question itself carried an edge that made bystanders uneasy even before anything physical happened. When Huy responded defensively, the tension between the two men quickly spilled over into the fistfight that drew attention from people standing nearby in the parking area. The fight did not last long before the entire situation escalated beyond fists, since witnesses later said Lam suddenly produced a handgun, turning what had started as a street scuffle into a life-threatening confrontation. As soon as the weapon appeared, Huy tried to escape the parking lot and rushed toward the entrance of the arcade, leaving a trail of blood behind him after the first shots were fired. Inside Mission Control, the noise and confusion erupted instantly because dozens of teenagers were packed between arcade cabinets when Huy stumbled through the doors searching for cover. While people scattered across the room and ducked behind machines, Lam reportedly followed inside and continued firing at close range, sending more panic through a space that had turned from a hangout into a crime scene within seconds. Huy Nguyen collapsed after the gunshot struck him, and although emergency crews eventually rushed him to the hospital, the injuries permanently damaged his body and left him partially paralyzed, creating another victim whose life had been permanently altered by the violence. Witnesses inside the arcade began describing the shooter to police, and several accounts pointed back toward Lam Nguyen, which gave detectives a troubling realization once they compared statements with earlier reports. Because the man described inside Mission Control sounded like the same suspect connected to the Garden Grove stoplight shooting, investigators began to suspect that both attacks might be part of a larger pattern unfolding across Little Saigon. Once that connection started forming inside police reports, the search for Lam Nguyen became far more urgent, since detectives were no longer looking at isolated fights, but at a young gunman whose violence seemed to be escalating fast. By late 1994, the rivalry between the Cheap Boys and the Nip family had moved beyond threats, arguments, and quick fights, which meant the streets around Westminster and Garden Grove were sliding towards something that felt closer to open warfare. What started as scattered confrontations gradually turned into repeated shootings, and every new incident made it harder for residents to pretend these were isolated problems involving a few reckless teenagers. Detectives from Westminster and Garden Grove police departments began comparing reports because victims, locations, and witness descriptions were pointing toward the same circle of Vietnamese gang members moving through Little Saigon. As investigators placed dates and locations side by side, they noticed that several shootings involved the same suspected gunman, and Lam Nguyen's name started appearing repeatedly inside police notes and interview transcripts. Around the neighborhood, people who spent time in Vietnamese cafes, pool halls, and late-night restaurants began talking quietly about the young shooter connected to those attacks, which meant Lam's reputation grew even before police publicly confirmed anything. Some witnesses described a slim young man who carried himself calmly during confrontations, while others remembered the unsettling detail that he often approached victims face to face rather than firing randomly from a passing car. Because many gang shootings in Southern California followed the drive-by pattern, Lam's willingness to step directly toward targets gave his actions a colder reputation inside the community. That style of violence also meant victims saw him clearly, which became important later when survivors began telling detectives exactly who they believed pulled the trigger. Fear slowly spread through Little Saigon as the shootings piled up, since many residents were refugees who had already escaped violence once before and now found themselves watching it reappear in the neighborhoods where they had tried to rebuild their lives. Shop owners started closing earlier at night. Families warned teenagers to stay away from certain arcades and parking lots, and whispers about gang retaliation moved through the same streets filled with Vietnamese restaurants and markets. At the same time, several victims from earlier shootings survived their injuries, which meant detectives had living witnesses who could describe what happened and who they believed was responsible. Those statements allowed investigators to begin mapping a rough timeline connecting the Garden Grove stoplight attack, the Mission Control arcade shooting, and other violent confrontations reported during the same months. Once detectives began arranging those events in order, the pattern suggested that the conflict between Cheap Boys and Nip family was not slowing down, and the next escalation would not simply involve wounded survivors, because within a short time, a confrontation tied to the same feud would move into a crowded restaurant during a major holiday celebration where the violence finally crossed the line into murder. That moment unfolded during Lunar New Year celebrations in early 1995, when families and groups of young people gathered across Little Saigon to share meals, exchange greetings, and celebrate the most important holiday in the Vietnamese calendar. One of those gatherings took place at Dong Con restaurant in Westminster, where several young men, including Lam Nguyen, sat together at a dinner table, enjoying the crowded atmosphere that usually marked the holiday season. While diners talked and waiters moved between tables carrying plates of food, witnesses later said Lam Nguyen had been seen outside near the entrance, standing quietly as people passed in and out of the building. Because Lunar New Year dinners often brought large crowds, nobody inside initially treated the young man outside as anything unusual. At some point during the evening, Lam Nguyen stepped away from the table and walked toward the entrance, possibly to check on something outside or to meet someone calling his name from the doorway. As he reached the entrance area, he encountered Lam Nguyen face to face, and several witnesses later described the interaction as strangely calm during the first seconds. According to accounts given later to police, Lam greeted Sang with a handshake, which made the moment appear friendly enough that nobody nearby immediately sensed danger. That calm greeting lasted only a moment, because Lam then produced a handgun and fired at close range before Sang had any chance to react. The gunshots struck Lam Nguyen in the stomach and then in the head, sending him collapsing near the restaurant entrance, while people inside froze in shock before panic spread through the dining area. Diners scrambled away from tables, some dropping plates and glasses, while others rushed toward exits, since the sound of gunfire shattered the holiday atmosphere in seconds. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but Sang's injuries proved fatal, turning the shooting into the first confirmed murder tied directly to the escalating gang conflict. In the days that followed, multiple witnesses told investigators they recognized the shooter as Lam Nguyen, which strengthened the growing case connecting him to the earlier attacks. With Lam Nguyen now dead and eyewitnesses pointing toward the same suspect, the feud between Cheap Boys and Nip family had crossed a line that made the situation impossible for authorities to ignore. Detectives understood that the violence had moved beyond intimidation or retaliation, because the gang war was now producing bodies, rather than wounded survivors. And as investigators continued following leads across Little Saigon, another killing connected to the same feud was already waiting just ahead. By March 1995, the violence tied to the Cheap Boys and Nip family rivalry had moved into a phase where shootings were happening so frequently that detectives in Orange County were struggling to keep pace with each new case report. One of the most disturbing incidents unfolded inside a laundromat where a young man named Duy Vu had been spending time shortly before the gunfire erupted. Witnesses later told investigators that the situation initially looked ordinary, since several men were seen talking casually with Duy, which made the encounter appear like a simple conversation rather than the beginning of an execution. Because laundromats were common neighborhood meeting spots where people waited for clothes to finish washing, nobody nearby realized that the conversation was quietly turning into a setup for violence. The tone of the moment changed instantly when the suspects pulled out a firearm and opened fire at close range, sending bullets into Duy Vu before anyone inside the building could react or escape the sudden chaos. The attack unfolded quickly enough that most witnesses only registered the shock of gunshots echoing through the room, while the suspects rushed out and disappeared before police could arrive. Duy Vu died from the injuries, which turned the laundromat shooting into another homicide tied to the same feud already shaking Little Saigon. Once detectives examined witness statements and compared them with earlier reports, several details pointed toward the same suspect whose name had already appeared in earlier shooting investigations. Investigators began suspecting Lam Nguyen's involvement because witnesses described a young Vietnamese man matching his appearance, and because the attack followed the same pattern detectives had already noticed in previous confrontations connected to Nip family members. Although police still needed stronger evidence before making an arrest, the growing number of incidents tied to the same name convinced detectives that the violence was no longer random retaliation between gangs. Instead, they believed one gunman might be responsible for several attacks across Westminster and Garden Grove. That suspicion grew even stronger when another shooting occurred only days later at a popular hangout known as the Rack and Q Pool Hall. Rack and Q had long been a gathering spot where young Vietnamese men played billiards and socialized, which meant rival gang members sometimes crossed paths there even when nobody came looking for trouble. On that particular night, Cheap Boys member Coy Huyen was inside when attackers suddenly targeted him, turning the familiar pool hall environment into another violent scene. Witnesses reported that gunfire erupted quickly and repeatedly, with at least 7 shots fired during the ambush as Huyen was struck several times. Despite the severity of the attack, Coy Huyen survived the shooting, although the injuries left permanent physical damage that echoed the pattern already seen in earlier cases. For detectives reviewing the case files, the survival of victims like Huyen and Tony Nguyen provided crucial testimony about who they believed had pulled the trigger during those confrontations. As investigators placed those statements beside one another, they saw the same suspect description appearing again and again, reinforcing the belief that a single shooter might be driving the conflict forward. By the time the pool hall ambush was added to the timeline, police were increasingly convinced that a violent spree was unfolding across Orange County. That realization pushed detectives to move faster because the pattern suggested another deadly encounter could happen at any moment. That final confrontation unfolded during a spring evening in May 1995 when members of Cheap Boys and Nip family crossed paths once again on the streets of Garden Grove, turning an ordinary night into the most violent clash of the feud. Tension between the groups had already been building for months, so when rival members recognized each other during the encounter, the situation escalated almost immediately. Gunfire broke out on the street as members from both sides exchanged shots, sending people nearby scrambling for cover while the fight moved quickly through the area. Amid the chaos of the shootout, a young man named Tuan Pham was struck multiple times, leaving him gravely wounded as the confrontation continued unfolding. Tuan Pham later died from his injuries, making the Garden Grove shootout the final fatal chapter in a string of shootings that had already left several victims wounded or dead across Little Saigon. Witnesses who observed the confrontation told investigators that Lam Nguyen had been among the shooters involved in the clash, which strengthened the growing case linking him to several violent incidents stretching back months. With multiple witnesses now identifying him in separate attacks, police intensified their efforts to locate the suspect before another shooting could take place. Detectives from several departments began coordinating information as they compared reports from Westminster, Garden Grove, and surrounding areas. Once the scale of the violence became clear, law enforcement agencies increased surveillance across Orange County using patrol units, informants, and aerial searches to track Lam Nguyen's movements. Helicopters circled neighborhoods where investigators believed he might be hiding, while detectives monitored locations connected to friends and relatives in hopes of spotting the fugitive. As the pressure from police continued rising, Lam Nguyen disappeared from public view, turning him into one of the most sought-after suspects in the region. That disappearance set the stage for the strange moment weeks later when the manhunt finally ended in a place nobody expected. By May 1995, the search for Lam Nguyen had stretched across Orange County with helicopters circling neighborhoods and detectives tracking leads. Yet the manhunt ended in a moment nobody expected. That morning, Lam walked into a medical clinic in Westminster, and the strange part was that police officers were already inside the building handling an unrelated matter. When the officers looked up and recognized the young fugitive tied to multiple shootings, the chase that had lasted weeks ended in seconds because Lam froze and realized escape was no longer possible. Officers immediately placed him under arrest, and once investigators finally had the suspect in custody, prosecutors began preparing one of the most complex gang-related cases Orange County had seen in years. As the case moved toward trial, the list of charges against Lam Nguyen grew longer because investigators connected him to several shootings, 2 murders, and multiple attempted killings tied to the feud between Cheap Boys and Nip family. During court proceedings, survivors of those attacks took the stand and described the moments when gunfire shattered their lives, giving jurors a direct account of the violence that had spread across Little Saigon. Tony Nguyen testified about the stoplight shooting that left him paralyzed, while other witnesses described the chaos inside Mission Control and the ambushes that followed. Their testimony carried weight because many of them had seen the shooter face to face, which meant prosecutors relied heavily on eyewitness identification to build the case. Lam's defense team argued that those identifications were unreliable and insisted their client had been framed by rivals looking to shift blame during a messy gang conflict. To strengthen that argument, Lam's sisters testified in court that he had been at home during one of the shootings, presenting an alibi meant to challenge the prosecution's timeline. The jury spent days reviewing witness statements, medical reports, and ballistics evidence before reaching its verdict. Ultimately, jurors convicted Lam Nguyen on most of the major charges, including murder and attempted murder, although not every count brought by prosecutors resulted in a guilty finding. Because of the brutality of the crimes and the pattern of violence shown during the trial, prosecutors pursued the death penalty, and the jury agreed, sentencing Lam Nguyen to death in one of the most significant gang-related verdicts in Orange County history. After the sentencing, Lam Nguyen was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where California houses inmates condemned to death, placing him inside one of the most notorious sections of the American prison system. Life there moved slowly because death row prisoners often spend decades waiting for executions while appeals move through the courts, and Lam became part of that long legal process. Over the years, attorneys filed appeals challenging the verdict and sentence, which meant his case remained active in the legal system long after the trial ended. While those legal battles unfolded in courtrooms, the memory of the shooting stayed alive in Little Saigon, where many residents still remembered the fear that spread through their neighborhoods during the 1990s gang conflicts.